Morning, all. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to our speaker, Dr. Prasenjit Biswas. Dr. Prasenjit Biswas is an associate professor of philosophy at the Northeastern Early University, Shillong. Widely read and traveled across universities in the West, he has authored and published 7 books and many research articles. His published books include Between Philosophy and Anthropology, A Porous of Language, Thought, and Consequences, 2017, Ethnic Life Worlds in Northeast India, 2008, Construction of Evil in Northeast India, 2012, among others. He specializes in social theory and continental philosophy. He has been a visiting fellow at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, University of Cambridge, South Florida University, Wayne State University, University of Lisboa, University of Ottawa, and many others. A regular columnist in national newspapers such as The Pioneer, The Statesman, The Millennium Post, and also appears in various TV channels including CNN, IBN, India Today, Northeast Live, Al Jazeera, Voice of America. His latest forthcoming work pertains to phenomenology and tribal philosophy. We are glad to have you here, sir. We look forward to today's lecture.
Thank you, Ashwant. Thank you, Ashwant. May I now request our Professor Dr. N.M. Hariharan to kindly set the stage for the lecture.
Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. To start with, to Professor Prasenjit Biswas, I don't know what to say. What the topic it is. In the area, in the system where people just go away from the place, if you just say philosophy, they run away from the place if you say mathematics, and if you say that the literature or the ethno identities of the populate, people just run away from the place. It is wrong assumption that it is a very complex subject, especially in India. And the topic that you have chosen is to illuminate, and for me, it is a type of an illumination that is needed for all those students who have been having or thinking about what is it called? It is a wrong notion which is being told them to call an end of a philosophy, or end of a political theory, or an end of a political ideology. It is wrongly understood, and I think the topic which you have chosen, that is about the bare life and the type of a democracy that we should have, or we likely to have, and in the eyes of Derrida, Foucault, and the Agamben, and probably this will enlighten them. That is the crux of our day today. Now, I'd like to spend just 2 minutes. I hope all of you will be with me. The philosophy, this is called the crux of a philosophy, it's called the center core of a philosophy, in the 16th century was shattered by a stone. The stone was science. And until then, the core was constructed by the various fields of knowledge. So there was no separation of mathematics, of philosophy, or rather it is called philosophy, or mathematics, astronomy, physiology, or any subject. And it was a science, and more particularly from the writings of the Cartesian philosophy, the Descartes, who brought a division between the mind and the body. It's called mind-body complex. And since then, the pieces, this is called a glass piece, philosophy called a glass piece, and it was hit by a stone, and it is broken and it is shattered, and all the pieces are traveling in different directions. And we are able to understand the different pieces which are traveling in different directions only in the 20th century. There's a one such piece called the linguistic philosophy. The another one is called the critical theory. The another piece was called is a mathematical philosophy. And the another piece called the philosophy of science. You know, we see that pieces are running here and there. And so has happened, you know, in the political philosophy itself. And because of the behavioral revolution, the political philosophy was considered to be dead. And actually it is not so. So as you see, you know, with the new type of a philosophical trend, especially in the 20th century, and that was stolen by many such concrete thinkers, not just one or two. We have Eric Vogel, Michael Oakeshott, Leo Strauss, and needless to say, John Rawls, Robert Nozick, or Herbert Marcuse. You know, you can see that they're all touching onto different pieces. So one is the post-Marxist, the neo-Marxist, the neo-conservative, the neo-contractualism. You know, we call neo. It's a new dimension. In a specific new dimension. And people in that particular sphere of, in the movement, especially in India, my perception is, especially in India, people wrongly construct many notions. For example, the God is dead. Actually, it is not so. And that is what, that is not the interest of, Robert Nozick. Or that was not the interest of the many of the thinkers to say that end of a political theory. See, the concept of God, which people now think about, what is it called as an atheism? The God is no more existing. People asking for proof to show me the God. You know, all this have to be revitalized in a very different perspective. So philosophy is taking the charge of revitalizing all those once considered to be an impact of a Marxism is now gaining its strength. So here in this particular context, I would like to add the last point for a day is the way in which democracy is being perceived by different thinkers and especially the different systems of life. As to say that, you know, democracy is a process. It can be called as a thought process. It can be called as an idea. It is called as a means. It is called a tool. It is called an instrument. And people try to, abuse, misuse that type of a democracy today. And it is in this particular misusing the concept of a democracy, the democratic system. And we see a new type of, a new thought process have come. And that was constructed by, in my opinion, that is what speaker would like to talk about today, is this by Derrida, who's called as a post-modernist, the post-linguistic philosopher who wanted to deconstruct everything so that it can reach people very clearly. And Foucault, and he's a postmodernist, he said, remove anything which is very, very traditional. Just dogmatic, which is mind-boggling. It is not necessary at all in day-to-day life. You have to reconstruct everything to reach people. So we call it a postmodern. That is M.F. Hussain. You take the paintings of M.F. Hussain, probably you'll understand that there is nothing you will find in the picture, but you have to understand the meaning to that. So every one's meaning is differ from each one of them. So that is the type of trend today. We call it the postmodern. And needless to say, the Agamben, the center of a personality among the three today, who talks about more in detail about the type of democracy, which should be, we have to bring it back in the idea of reinventing the divine origin theory. So he's a critic of that, and he also indirectly is trying to support on that. So the new political theory, the new political philosophy after 20th century, we normally think it is just a Marxist, or it is just a reaction to the Marxists, or it is all about a critical theory, or we just discard the past, you just move towards something new called the postmodern. And it is not so. And we see the new thinkers, and for me, Andy Sanders, or maybe John Rawls, Robert Nozick. We have the contemporary philosophers like Mary Dolly. They're all talking about the reconstruction of the old past to bring about something which is called a communitarianism, or the new concept of justice, or the new concept of law, the new concept of a state, the new concept of the governance. So thank you very much for giving an opportunity to introduce this subject. And I think Professor Biswas will definitely is going to enlighten us in the new trend in the philosophy. Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for giving this opportunity.
So do I go ahead, Professor Hariharan?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
okay, sure. So
Thank you very much, sir.
So my very respected Professor Hariharan, the members of the staff of the Madras Christian College, organizer Dr. Hans Freddy, and my very dear students. Welcome and good morning to all of you. In fact, it's a great welcome for me as Professor Hariharan so succinctly explained the recent trends in political theory. And in his very, very important introduction, he raised the question about a new language of democracy and understanding the new language of politics, which is absolutely needed for doing political theory in the context of India and in the context of the world. So what is the new language of politics and political theory now? It's a language of engagement and the language of disengagement. Both happen simultaneously and together. The moment one is engaged in an encounter, it is that moment, that very moment, that one feels decentered. One also experiences a certain kind of deterritorialization, a certain kind of decontextualization from one's own field of experience or from one's own field of knowledge. In a sense, this experience of getting decontextualized, getting deterritorialized, is something that political theory needs to address today. So in a sense, what the theories of democracy has taught us, which was a language of right, language of ownership, language of engagement, language of representation, and language of building up a collective which is legitimate as a form of existence. All these have come to a certain kind of problematization at this point. So in a sense, democracy emerges to be the biggest problematic of today's political theory. All right. So the theories of democracy, theorists of democracy, such as Thomas Pogge or Anthony Kenny, they have argued that democracy has lost large part of its meaning primarily because democracy is not able to address the question of redistribution, the question of inequality, and the question of equal representation of the vulnerable, victimized groups into the political system. And this is a very large critique of the First World democracy. In contrast to the First World democracy, the condition of Third World democracy is precisely this, that the political system is not able to absorb, appropriate, and organize itself in a legitimate manner the kinds of struggle and the kinds of questions that are emerging from bottom up, from the very stratum of the society in which the system is working. So therefore, the crisis for Third World democracy is a failure to represent, a failure to articulate the question of rights, and also a part failure in ensuring justice based on rights and entitlements. So therefore, a kind of an internal critique of the democratic system has been a major engagement with the politics of the day. And the moment one is engaged with such failings of the democratic system, one also has to find a way out. Now, to begin with, I would draw your attention to understanding the very nature of engagement. How does one understand the very nature of engagement? One way of understanding the nature of engagement is in terms of the purpose that a certain engagement is going to serve. And the idea of purpose is explained in purposive rational theories of democracy. And purposive rational theories of democracy, which piggybacks itself on Weberian forms of rationalization. on a certain form of acting with a certain purpose, the purpose predefined and predetermined by a powerful section. So purposive rational action bases itself on a certain logic of power. And the logic of power is not necessarily a logic of empowerment. It does not empower the participants of power. It rather creates a set of subjects who are subjected to a certain kind of protocol, a certain kind of rule or norm or value, which is decided to be the ruling value or the ruling idea in a particular system. So in a sense, purposive rational action has given rise to ideologies in a democracy. And these ideologies have shaped up the mentality of the people. It has shaped up the kind of institutions, the logic of which has to be in line with or in conformity with the logic of the purposive rationality that a particular political system espouses. So this is all about a purposive rational understanding of democracy. But purposive rational understanding has its own limitation. It does not empower the political subjects to question the political system. That remains to be a very, very important limitation. So in the purposive rational scheme of things, if one lives in a democracy, and if that democracy has a certain kind of a government, people and the subjects have to conform to the logic, to the rule, to the norm, to the dictats of that government. Now, conforming to the dictats of a government or to the logic of a system is certainly not entirely a system which ensures freedom of expression, which ensures the right to life, or which ensures the fundamental rights which are part of constitutional laws and procedures under which a democracy is operating in today's world. So constitutional law doesn't allow falling in line with a system. Rather, it asks for a greater scrutiny, a greater vigilance, a greater art of reasoning for understanding how a democracy is functioning and where exactly it is somehow infringed or somehow prohibited in coming to terms with its own objectives and goals. Now, apart from this purposive, rational kind of an action, what otherwise can happen is a certain kind of a certain sense of moving out of the limits of purposive rational action, and one can move out of the purposive rational action provided one really looks for a way out, an exit from the sphere of purposive rational action. That doesn't mean that one moves out of purpose. That simply means that one questions the purpose and one tries to build up an alternative possibility of the purpose. And when one tries to build up an alternative, one looks for an alternative paradigm of argumentation or alternative paradigm of a discourse in terms of which one can re-articulate, refashion, re-engage the existing limits which are arising in the current democratic form of the government. So therefore, within democracy, it is strongly possible, without lapsing into anarchy, to question the dominant purpose and the system of values, and to curve out an alternative which reorganizes the very democratic system itself. Now, this kind of an experimentation and engagement with democracy has been going on. We know this idea of democratic socialism as it was practiced by the Nehruvian state in India. The idea of democratic socialism has been a parallel experiment in democracy, that is an individual right and pluralism, mixed to it an idea of socialist kind of ownership over property or over the means of production. Our constitutional values are in line with the notion of democratic socialism. So we have a kind of an idea of socialist pattern of society, which exactly is not a copy of a hardcore socialist society, but it's a kind of a creative experimentation between what goes in the name of socialism and what comes in the form of democracy. And therefore you have thinkers like Ram Manohar Lohia, you have Jayaprakash Narayan, you have a host of socialists who have created an articulation of public interest or collective ownership of public resources or distribution of public resources in a fair and justifiable manner so that one doesn't fall short of social justice. So social justice in a democratic socialist experiment has remained to be a major plank in understanding the functioning of Indian democracy. Now this is an alternative plank which is provided right in the Constitution of India. So we are lucky to inherit a constitution which Dr. Ambedkar has written and which Constituent Assembly has passed after a long debate and deliberation to ensure social justice for the marginalized, for the underprivileged, for the underclass, and to create a formal system of ensuring social justice for the underprivileged within the functioning of very democracy. So therefore, you have this grand experiment of political theory in India, which is manifest in every word of the Constitution of India, which is drafted by the Constituent Assembly and especially by Baba Saheb Ambedkar, which combines this creative experimentation between democracy and socialism in order to expand the space of representation. Now, this kind of an alternative has to be brought in the language of theory. How does one bring the idea of an alternative in the language of theory? As opposed to the purposive, rational kind of practice of democracy, one can seek an alternative way of seeking the truth about democracy, an alternative way of organizing ourselves with a set of alternative principles, laws, ideas, visions, which remains always germane and open-ended in the functioning of democracy. Democracy allows for that elbow room of a moral, political, cultural, economic, social alternative. And to build up that alternative, one looks for an alternative, a different articulation. One looks for a principle by which one can make a difference and one can hold on to a different position and one can indeed take a different position in the discourse of political realities. So holding on to a different position, articulating a sense of difference, understanding that difference in terms of reasoning and logic, and then placing it in the public discourse, and then trying to democratize that alternative by ensuring participation of the most vulnerable and the marginalized. These are the forms of alternative that one can explore within the space of democracy. Now, this entire way of seeking an alternative is famously called by Jürgen Habermas. Of course, I'm not discussing Jürgen Habermas here. Jürgen Habermas, the famous German philosopher, sociologist, and political theorist, has talked about emancipatory argumentation as opposed to mere instrumental reasoning or argumentation. Purposive rational action is merely instrumental, while emancipatory action or arguments for emancipatory alternative is not part of the purposive rational framework of democracy. It rather goes beyond the purposive rational framework of democracy. It transcends the purposive rational everyday focus of democracy and projects an alternative as the future of democracy, towards which a different kind of articulation, a different principle can be broached, which is available among a large number of alternatives and which could be chosen by the participants of a democracy. So therefore, the fact of participation, the fact of choice, and the fact of available alternatives from which one can choose an alternative or one can experiment between alternatives is the kind of logic of emancipation that Jürgen Habermas talked about in his sharp distinction between the purpose of a system and the alternatives that can be framed from being within the system, not by moving out of the system. And that kind of a logicking, that kind of an argumentation is emancipatory in the language of Habermas. Now, this basically would tell you which way the democratic theory is moving now. democratic theory is moving towards an alternative or an alternative kind of democracy, which is beyond the democracy of conducting regular elections or democracy of electing a few elected representatives, but to ensure a larger framework of alternative possibilities, which can become part of argumentation and reasoning that is facilitated in a democracy. So a democracy facilitates moving beyond itself. It facilitates a certain kind of transcendence, which does not mean moving out of democracy, but it means seeking an alternative among the possibilities that arise from within the framework of democracy. So this is how political theory is getting re-understood and reinterpreted, or rather rebuilt. One of the interesting way of looking at this alternatives to democratic theory is to think about a kind of a politics of virtue that Professor Horiharan has suddenly mentioned, of course. In the dystopian world of today, it seems that political virtue is the last thing. Instead of political virtue, the virtues that are practiced by politicians include how does one heckle the opponent, and how does one give a knockdown or a kind of a nose blow to the opponent in terms of an argument or in terms of an action. So in other words, the political opposition is continually undermined in terms of the virtue of a politician at this moment. But the notion of political virtue that Nietzsche in Thus Spake Zarathustra espoused is that of accommodating a different way of thinking, a different way of thinking that comes from one who is culturally different and one who is probably holding a different political viewpoint. So difference becomes the key word in Nietzschean understanding of politics. Politics is to make a difference for Nietzsche, and the difference to a level whereby the existing dominant forms of politicking are challenged. And in order to find a difference in politics, one has to practice this virtue of making a difference. And what is this virtue of making a difference? The virtue of making a difference is not to have this kind of a weak moral standing, as Nietzsche calls it. The weak moral standing is to subscribe to the available dominant moral ideas or practice the prescribed sets of relations which are permitted. It is rather a little more transgression, a kind of a transgressive morality, a morality of questioning, a morality of accommodating that which is totally different from what is currently in vogue, and that is what is a political virtue for Nietzsche. Now, this kind of a notion of political virtue, Nietzsche would say, does not arise from an Aristotelian notion of polity, which banks itself on the fixed rules and determinations of values. A polity which is predetermined or conditioned by a set of fixed values will not allow this kind of a politics of difference, will not allow the idea of the virtue of making a difference, will not allow that. And therefore, the polity, which is like the purposive rational action, and which is organized around a certain set of purposes, won't allow questioning, won't allow making a difference. And in making a difference only lies a virtue. Otherwise, there is no virtue in politics, Nietzsche would argue. So Professor Horiharan mentioned that Nietzsche's, God is dead, is not literally God is dead. So we still have a sense of the divine, as Aurobindo, the Indian thinker, would say. Imacodo, as Latin thinkers would say. A kind of a divine spark in us, a kind of a spiritual sense of belonging or co-belonging in this planetary situation of the world. So that sense of co-belonging, that sense of creating a difference in order to co-belong or belong together, is to evoke a different sense of divinity, is to evoke a different sense of spirituality. And if you like, is to evoke a different or an alternative sense of divinity, an alternative sense of spirituality, of co-belonging, of respecting each other's difference, or also creating a sense of difference between ourselves without breaking us to various kind of cocoons. We create a sense of difference in order to nourish a healthy sense of argumentation. The perennial argumentative Indian has to create a different kind of argument in order to create a more livelier, more dynamic, a more flourishing sense of democracy. And that is how the idea or the attraction for an alternative becomes very, very important in pursuing an emancipatory logic, as Jürgen Habermas would say. But that's not the main part of my talk. And the main part of my talk where I want to get into is that whether such a pursuance of an alternative allow us for a greater degree of freedom, or whether it allows us for a more flexible articulation of political rights is the question. The moment we enter into the sphere of politics, any claim of right becomes essentially contestable. In other words, a claim of right made by a group or an individual is contested at the institutional level. Now, once it is contested at the institutional level, how do you go about it? You know, the contestation will always happen. That doesn't mean that one should not put forth a claim of right. So the claim of right has to be pursued in a rational manner, in a manner that the reasons for pursuance of a certain assertion of right is acceptable to other people. People who are not asserting that kind of right, but who are able to yield to your claim of right, because your claim of right looks to be justified, and it's going to create a better world for everyone together. So a claim of right has to ensure the larger common good, you can say, in a democracy. If it cannot ensure the larger common good, but it only goes for a sectarian assertion of good of a certain group of people, minus the good of other people, then that kind of a claim would be contested more vigorously than a claim which would ensure a more universal kind of good for everyone alike. So one has to arrive at that universal idea of good by way of seeking an alternative in the sphere of politics. But does it happen in the sphere of politics is the question from where I get into the continental European tradition of philosophy. In the democratic tradition of political theory, the notion of a democratic alternative has always been clubbed with the institutional possibility of an alternative. But in the European continental philosophical tradition, the idea of an alternative is very interesting. The idea of an alternative is necessarily the idea of a critique of the existing ways of understanding, critique of the existing worldviews, critique of the existing institutional network, and critique of the system as such. And you can start with a kind of a spar from Karl Marx, who for the first time developed the idea of critiquing the worldview. Hegel's notion of philosophy of right, which looked for a certain kind of alternative by looking at the kind of dialectic that happens between the thesis and the antithesis, but which does not necessarily lead you to a certain kind of a transformation of the existing political order, was upturned by Marx by saying that the dialectics between thesis and antithesis would necessarily lead you to a synthesis only when the existing political order is transformed. So critique, which aims at transformation, remained as the major thrust of European political theory. It's not just a search for an alternative, as it is there in democratic political theory, but it is a kind of a critique that develops itself in order to transform the existing political order. Of course, Marx took a revolutionary standpoint. Now, entire procedure and process of transforming the existing order is not necessarily revolutionary, because very few revolutions happen, and much of the revolutions couldn't really live up to the ideals which the revolution espoused. So therefore, there is a slow and steady process of transformation, like in the Aesop's fable, the proverbial hare or the tortoise, that leads us to the transformation of the political order by slowly walking through the entire tortuous trajectory of transformation. So unless we are ready to walk the talk in order to transform, the logic of emancipation probably cannot work. So in the European continental philosophical tradition, the idea of critique as the idea of producing an alternative plank of argumentation, as an idea of creating an alternative form of reasoning, becomes very, very important. A critique necessarily starts with the existing one, existing worldview or existing set of ideas, and it moves beyond the existing set of ideas to a new set of ideas by way of critiquing what is in existence. So the idea of critique becomes very important in European political theory. Now, how does the critique move from the existing political system or the worldview is an important question. You have heard about Michel Foucault, important French political thinker and theorist, who explained knowledge or epistemology or our ideas about the world or ideas about how to act in the social world. All these ideas actually are a byproduct of the existing power relations that obtain in a certain political system or in a certain institutional framework, if you like. So what is this idea of power relations? That is an important question for Michel Foucault. So Foucault gives a proper exposition to the idea of power relations. And if I put it in a succinct manner for the students, it will look like this, that power relations develop themselves on the basis of a set of ideas. So what are those set of ideas that power relations bank itself upon is an important question. Now Foucault would say that every idea has a genealogy of its own. It has a lineage. It has a descent. It has a certain way of coming down through the course of history. And in the process, it undergoes several conceptual changes or conceptual transformations. And one has to understand how these power relations build up in the process of moving down the memory lane or down the lane of history. One has to understand that. Foucault calls it genealogical, how a certain notion of power arises from a certain configuration of people or a certain configuration of institutions. For example, in the Roman state, the idea of slavery, the famous Spartacus revolution. Spartacus rebelled against the notion of slavery. He not only freed himself from slavery, but he abolished the system of slavery itself. Now, Spartacus created the first spark of democracy, the first spark of an anti-slavery movement that has gone down through the 20th century. In America, you have this famous anti-slavery movement that has led to the Civil War, and that has brought the American Constitution in picture after the Civil War. Okay, so therefore, Civil War for abolition of slavery is connected to Spartacus's revolution or rebellion against slavery. So the notion of moving out of slavery has this rich genealogical past, starting from Spartacus down to the Civil War in America. There is a long trajectory of change of the concept. At the very beginning, the concept of slavery was just to surrender oneself and produce the bodily labor in the service of the master. So it became a certain kind of a unconditional submission of the slave to the master. Okay, Now in Hegel, you can see in Hegel's philosophy of right, Hegel is talking about master-slave relationship, but in totally different tenor. He is talking about master-slave relationship in terms of reciprocation. It's a kind of a reciprocal relationship. And this reciprocal relationship arose with the European Enlightenment, when the institution of slavery was no longer sustainable, because slavery has to give its way to equal rights and recognition of the work by the slaves in terms of, bartering them with certain resources or paying them certain wages. So therefore, the unilateral or one-way traffic between the master and the slave got transformed into a two-way traffic, into a reciprocal relationship where one depends on the other. The slave depends on the master for the wages, and master depends on the slave for the work to be done, without which, the two-way relationship will not work. And this has emerged in 15th or 16th century Europe, about which Hegel has written in his philosophy of right. Indeed, the whole idea of right has its origin in this master-slave relationship, Hegel would point out. Foucault takes a cue from Hegel and would go a step further. He would say, until and unless this power relationship between master and the slave is understood in concrete terms, in terms of exchange, in terms of the mutual connection between the master and the slave, we won't be able to decode the exact nature of the master and slave relationship. Whether power relations in a modern democratic world replicates the master-slave relationship, whether it replicates the patron-client relationship, whether it replicates the ruler and the ruled relationship, or what kind of relationship? Is it a kind of a binary relationship that one can categorize the two sides of the relation? Foucault is asking this question. Well, the genealogy of the modern state produces a binary. But does that mean that we have to explain power relations in binary terms? Can't we move beyond binary terms of these power relations as established by the modern state? Is a question of Foucault. So Foucault would answer, well, we can move beyond it if we think that, power is everywhere. And you do not have a fixed point of origin of power. Power is dispersed. So power relations are dispersed everywhere, and it is the power relations through which all other social relations are shaped or determined. But determined not in a deterministic sense, but determined in the sense that social relations are shaped, configured, and structured by power relations, which keep varying, altering, changing, and even transforming themselves into different sets of possible human relations. So power relations become human relations, and human relations become power relations for Foucault, if we take it to be decentered and not fixed on a certain point of origin. So Foucault, in a sense, changes the trajectory of understanding the genealogy of power relations. Now, if genealogy of power relations is completely changed, what arises is that within the power relations, you can think of a democratic alternative. If democracy means a set of dispersed power relations not in the command of a commanding center, or not in the control of a government. If you think of that kind of power relations, then it is possible to seek an alternative kind of power relation, whereby the relationship can become smooth, more unobstructed, and more open. It is possible to have that kind of an alternative, or an alternative set of power relations within democracy. Now Foucault develops a critique of democratic power relations, and he calls it governmentality. Govern-mentality. Government for Foucault is nothing but governmentality. And governmentality is guided by a certain logic. And very interestingly, the logic of governmentality is not to control, is not to shape the emerging patterns of power relations is not to predecide how the society would behave or how the individual would behave, but it is only to keep an eye on how people are behaving, what people are doing, what is their individual choice, what they are thinking, and how they are actually trying to realize their thoughts and visions. So you just keep an eye on everyone, and that is the logic of governmentality. Now, the mentality part of the logic is that a ruler or our representatives cannot free themselves from this binding obligation or this binding obsession to keep an eye on others. And power is defined by Foucault as never a direct relationship. It's a relationship of influencing someone else without being seen that one is influencing someone else. So one influences someone else by indirect means, maybe by words or by certain kind of action, without being seen to be influencing or exercising power over someone else. So power relations become more dispersed. Anyone who influences, anyone who tries to affect the action of the other, and in turn creates an effect, E-W-F-C-T, effect. One affects with an A in order to create an effect, and Foucault calls it the truth effect, or he calls it as the subject effect. The power relations are operated in a manner that it creates its own truth. And once it creates its own truth, these truths create a set of subjects who believe in that truth. So truth effect leads to subject effect if the power relations are dispersed. And that is how modern democratic institutions and their governmentality of keeping an eye on everyone else without being seen to be keeping that eye, you never know where is the eye, but the eye is being kept. So there is this interesting duality here between the I as the self and I as the vision. The duality between I and I is the duality produced by the power relations. And this is an important step in the critique of power relations. So two important steps then are taken in the critique of power relations here until now by Foucault. One important step is the critique of governmentality. And through that critique of governmentality, to emerge at the duality between the I and the I, whereby the I cannot see itself seeing. The I which is kept on someone else does not see itself seeing. That I itself is blind, Foucault would point out. Now, the third interesting step in that power relation is the idea of biopower, whereby the lives and the deaths of people are determined by the logic of governmentality or the logic of creating the truth effect. As if Foucault would say that there is this anthropological machine, Foucault would say. An anthropological machine is all about shaping lives, is all about taking the control of life. Now, how does one take the control of life? One does not take the control of life by using direct power or using direct political institutions, but one uses science, technology to manipulate at the level of genes or to manipulate ideas by using media, so that the effect of all this is the control. Control which is without a control. Supervision which is without a supervisor. Power which is without the holder of a power. But at the same time, the effect of all this is a certain kind of a control on everyone's life. Now, this is what Foucault defines as biopower. So power relations through the logic of governmentality, by refining the logic of governmentality, by manipulating the logic of governmentality, produces what he calls as biopower, a kind of an unconditional power, where power is all dispersed, it cannot be seen, and at the same time power subjects the life and death of its subjects. It governs the life and death of its subjects, in a manner that the journey from life to death is actually controlled, is actually regulated. So it is a certain kind of a regulation of the life and death. And in the process of regulation of the life and death, what the governmentality or the logic of governmentality creates, Foucault calls it the biopolitical, the, the, the invincible, the inalienable link, the inalienable link between life and politics, the inalienable link between living, the act of living, and the act of doing politics, as if politics is to decide the life and death questions. When politics decides the life and death questions, and it impinges on the lives of individual subjects, or the lives of a group or a collective, it becomes biopolitical, Foucault would call it. Now, Foucault would say that the whole idea of biopolitics is to create a set of subjects who would move in a certain trajectory and who would aim at securing certain aspects of life by privileging it over death. So life will be privileged over death by way of a certain kind of a politics. And this kind of a politics of privileging life over death is what is biopolitics. And this politics is indirect. It happens through a set of mediations, a set of manipulations. Mediations through the media, mediations through speech, mediations through argumentation, mediations through representations, and also manipulation by using certain techniques, such as techniques of manipulating the genes, the production of genetically modified crop, or creation of genetically modified species, or creating a certain kind of high-yielding variety genes for enhanced production of food and for security of the food cycle. These are part of biopolitics. Now, biopolitics importantly involves another kind of politics. It is a politics of death. It's not just the politics of life privileged over the death, but it is also politics of death. The state ensures, by way of incarceration, by way of mass murder, by genocide, by deploying certain kind of forces and certain actors and factors, that it leads to deaths of certain kind of people. And you can understand what kind of death is promoted by the political system. The political system promotes death of its dissenters, starting from the death of Socrates to the death of Chinese professor Wan Bao, or to the death of the Hong Kong protesters, the death of the Tiananmen Square protesters, or the death of Jallianwala Bagh, or incarceration of anti-CAA protesters. All these are part of this politics of death, whereby certain kind of lives are disqualified by the logic of governmentality. They are disqualified as exterior, or as something which falls beyond the scope of the law, procedure, and norm, in terms of which the power relations are currently working through. So a certain set of lives are purged out, they are excommunicated, and they are pushed to the death row, or they are incarcerated, even if they are not penalized by death. Incarceration is a form of suspension of life. So modern state uses this kind of techniques to manipulate the life itself and to produce a sense of life where certain lines and certain boundaries are drawn in a manner that the subjects have to fall within those demarcated lines, and they have to speak those spoken words or sign between the dotted lines so that they do not cross to the other side of the boundary. So certain boundaries, certain Lakshman Rekhas are drawn between life and death. One who crosses that Lakshman Rekha is to be regulated now by a politics of death, a politics which disqualifies a certain kind of life. Now, this kind of a logic of governmentality is not exactly democratic. What kind of logic of governmentality is this? Foucault brings us to this point of biopolitics, but he doesn't have a longer life to explain to us the nature, the exact character of this biopolitics. And this is explained by the living Italian philosopher who is in his 60s and who is still able to read, write, and think more and more, and able to publish much and much at this moment of the pandemic in terms of the framework of biopower and biopolitics, by taking it to the next logical step, which he calls as the state of exception. A state of exception is the power of the state to make an exception within the stipulated laws and procedures, so that by making such an exception, the law itself can regulate the conditions of life or death. So making an exception is to create a kind of a lawlessness, but at the same time, this kind of a lawlessness or making an exception aims at creating a politics of death, or to privilege a politics of death over politics of life. And Giorgio Agamben calls it a state of exception. Now, in the normal sense of state of exception, whenever there is a state of emergency, certain rules, norms, and conventions are suspended. And by suspending those laws, norms, and conventions, a certain kind of urgency is mooted. For example, in the pandemic, it is all an argument about an emergency. And because of the emergency, people cannot move out, they cannot run the economy, and they have to follow a certain strict protocol and procedure. Now, Agamben points out this kind of a life led by a consideration of emergency is lawlessness, is to create a state of exception, and then to universalize the state of exception across the world, not just in Italy, but across the world. Now that state of exception is universalized. Anytime the regular, usual, and the rights that are granted in the Constitution can be suspended in order to regulate life and death. So far, the idea of democracy has been to regulate life and death by using the sphere of right. Now, by a logic of emergency, the logic of democracy is upturned in a manner that now life and death and the emergencies such as medical emergency, or such an emergency of a sudden, break off, a sudden disaster or a sudden calamity, which would affect the life and death of millions, will now regulate the sphere of rights. So sphere of rights will become subject of the regulation of life and death. And this is precisely where state of exception gets universalized. Agamben, in one of his recent articles about state of exception, which is written in 2020, during the pandemic, pointed out that because of this fear of death, because of this artificially induced sense of emergency, the doctrine of rights, which is articulated in American Constitution as the Charter of Rights of Man, the Magna Carta Charter. The Charter of Magna Carta is now subjected to a politics of life and death. So therefore, the sphere of rights is now upturned by the state of exception for Agamben. And that seems to be a very sound theoretical position to understand the present situation of our life. In our present situation of life, seemingly, it is the politics of death that has taken over the politics of life. And when the politics of death takes over the politics of life, what happens to our individual existence or existence of the community? Agamben gives an answer to this question. As far as individual existence is concerned, the individual becomes a bare body, a body which is bared of its usual predications of dignity, predications of the valued rights that one carries in terms of being an individual, in terms of being a person. All that is bared out. all that is bared off. And bearing off the life of rights, of values, of dignity, of individuality, of community is described as bare life by Agamben. You remember that bare life, is a byproduct of our politics of death. So we create a politics of death by participating in a state of exception. And participating in a state of exception as if we are responding to an emergency or responding to a collective fear which dominates the current scenario is like producing a bare life, is like bearing our life off of the right, of the entitlement, of the dignity, of the constitutional guarantee or the constitutional immunity that we have as part of our political and social life. So this is a certain kind of loss of immunity, a loss of dignity that occurs when one participates in a state of exception and agrees with the logic of governmentality, which Agamben calls as the bare life. So in the words of Agamben, with the pandemic, bare life is produced across the world, and bare life has infested, like the coronavirus itself. The bare life has infested, it has intruded, it has inflicted a great harm to our democratic consciousness and to our democratic thinking, as if it has been taken as a fait accompli that without bare life, we cannot ensure our life, we cannot secure ourselves against the possible death inflicted by the coronavirus. So therefore, bare life has become the norm. And when bare life becomes the norm, it is a state of exception, a state of making exception to the Constitution, to the law. And this resembles 1933, Hitler's rise, the rise of Third Reich, when the Constitution was suspended. And the bare life was produced for the first time, which Agamben pointed out was a life in a camp, a life in a perpetual incarceration. The whole society is like a camp where every individual member is an inmate in a prison or in a camp, and they have to follow the rules of being an inmate in a prison or in a camp. So universalization of bare life, by universalizing the state of exception, produces a universal camping, a universal form of a camp, which encumbers the whole set of democratic institutions in which we otherwise normally live. So the state of exception, the bare life, and the universalization of this kind of a politics of death, has become the new normal. The new normal is the normal of the bare life, as Agamben would argue. Now, this is the height of biopolitics, Agamben would point out, in continuation of Foucault's argument about power relations in the continental European tradition. So in other words, in the continental European tradition, they are concerned about a certain kind of political immunity that a political subject enjoyed in a democracy. In a democracy, fundamental rights are protected and they cannot be suspended under any circumstances. Right to life can never be suspended within all the democratic constitutions of India, constitutions of the world, such as Constitution of India or Constitution of US or Constitution of France. Right to life remains fundamental, which can never be suspended. But in a state of exception, what is suspended at the very beginning is the right to life. Right to life is suspended, which is making a great exception to the constitutional law and the procedure in a situation of emergency, which seems to be the new normal in this moment of pandemic that Agamben theorizes at this moment. So therefore, we have arrived at a moment of the state of exception, a moment of the bare life, from which there is no exit or no easy way out at this point of time. So is there a way out? Can we really flesh out a logic of emancipation from this bare life? Becomes an important question for us. Now that we are looking for a vaccine, whether that vaccine will restore normalcy, the normalcy of free movement, free choice, free activity, economic, commercial, political, academic, all kinds of activity, which is free of these bounds of maintaining physical distance, whether that could be restored. Is there a way out? Is an important question that Agamben poses. Now, this posing of the question is also related to the idea of expanding the sphere of rights, and also to take care of the needs of the vulnerable and the marginalized. Whether we can re-establish a regime of right that can take care of the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and at the same time could secure the sphere of right, could immunize the sphere of right from any kind of distortion, exception that is made in the condition of emergency, is an important question that Agamben raises. Now, one answer to the question that Agamben gives is very, very provocative. His provocative answer is that biopolitics has probably ended its utility. There should be a declared ending of the biopolitics in a democratic state, such as in European Union. European Union, which has a human rights framework ensuring the rights of the vulnerable, even the rights of the stateless people, which allows all the rights for everyone, including the legal and the illegal immigrants in the European Union, once they are admitted inside the European Union, and which provides the most universal of all the frameworks of right at this moment, by expanding the scope of human rights and the right to life, is the answer when we declare a formal end to biopolitics. And Agamben is advocating a formal ending of the biopolitics at this point of time. Now, this kind of a possibility of emergence of biopolitics and the call for ending biopolitics has already been there in another prolific French thinker of last century and of the present century, Professor Jacques Derrida. Professor Derrida, in his writing on cosmopolitanism, on friendship, in the famous book called Politics of Friendship, or the other book called Rogues, Two Essays on Democracy, where he has an essay on right to democracy and right to philosophy. He combines that right to democracy is a right to philosophy, a right to philosophization. So anyone who is ready to philosophize and who is philosophizing about his own life at his micro world is living in a state of democracy. So we have to establish a state of democracy which allows for free thinking, free reasoning, free articulation of an alternative, and therefore a kind of an unconstrained free critique of the existing system, which is the ultimate objective of the European line of political thinking, is to establish the right to critique, which would be related to the right to have a life without exception, or right to completely curtail the possibility of a bare life, are all connected. And how these connections could be established in political theory is an important question. Derrida's answer is that you can establish a large fraternity by a politics of friendship that overtakes the politics of death, that Foucault and Agamben have critically pointed out as a consequence of modern democratic institutional functioning, can now be overtaken by a cosmopolitan, a planetary politics of friendship. Now, Derrida derives this notion of politics of friendship from Aristotle and from Marx. From Aristotle, he derives this notion of friendship. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics talks about friendship as a virtue. Friendship as the most important democratic virtue. And if we take friendship to be most important democratic virtue, Derrida explains that we cannot really settle for an enemy in democracy. We cannot consider an adversary as an enemy. As Biden, in his victory speech, has famously stated to Mr. Trump that you are only a political rival. You are not even my political foe or a political enemy. The concept of enemy, which is part of the state of exception. A state of exception or a state of emergency, consider people to be its enemy. The idea of enemy has to be given up in pursuing a politics of friendship. And the politics of friendship is little more than the notion of equality, liberty, and fraternity, in the sense that friendship is that state of existence when one is ready to unconditionally give without an expectation of return. Friendship is without an expectation of return. It's like a gift that one offers without any expectation of return. Derrida articulates a notion of friendship, and he connects it to the Jewish notion of debt. One is a friend provided one is perpetually in debt to someone. And the sense of debt is expressed in the sense of unconditional giving without expecting any return. So if we can establish that kind of an institutional nature of friendship, where debt also becomes institutional, and debt is guaranteed in terms of giving, and giving is guaranteed in terms of ensuring a regimen of right where friendship and fraternity is never broken off. If you can have that kind of an institution, that is what democracy envisages. That is what democracy projects to be its future. If we have to think about future of democracy, we have to think about this institution of unconditional giving without an expectation of return, so that one carries this pleasant experience of being in debt, not that experience of being in misery of debt, but the experience of pleasure of debt, where one gives without an expectation of return. If we can institutionalize that kind of an ethical relationship, not just a political relationship, when political transforms itself into ethical, and in Aurobindo's word, politics that transforms itself into an alternative divinity, alternative spirituality. And in Derrida's word, that kind of a friendship would be an alternative notion of friendship, a far better, enhanced, chiseled, refined, improved notion of friendship than the current idea of friendship as mutual reciprocation, as it was in master-slave relationship. Friendship moves beyond this master-slave relationship and goes from the domain of the conditioned to the domain of the unconditional, where unconditional act of giving is recognized without an expectation of return, as Derrida argues in his Politics of Friendship. And that depends on a certain sense of responsibility towards others, those who are absolutely other, those who are not part of my culture, those who are totally different. And if one is having an infinite sense of responsibility towards other, then it is possible to think of an alternative human relationship, moving beyond master-slave relationship, moving beyond power relationship, moving beyond biopolitics, and emerging into a politics of friendship, which will require a new form of institution to come. Now, Derrida calls it a democracy to come, and a democracy to come that overcomes the bare life, that overcomes the logic of governmentality, establishes an act of unconditioned giving or an unconditional giving without an expectation of a return, a kind of an ethical debt to the other, to the radically other, and which is institutionalized in the form of democratic norms, principles, and constitution, then that kind of democracy is yet to come, which has not yet arrived. And that kind of democracy, Derrida calls, is a certain kind of messianism. It's a messianic vision of a democracy. A messianic vision of a democracy which does not require a messiah, but it emerges from the current precincts of or current closures of the present democratic order, which cannot move towards an infinite sense of responsibility. So one has to break through this constrained, bounded kind of democracy and move towards an institutional form where infinite responsibility is asserted, where unconditional act of giving can be pursued as an ethical act. And Derrida calls it, very interestingly, unreserved hospitality. An unreserved hospitality towards the other, where a new set of institutions will produce care, love, an infinite act of giving without any expectation of return. That is the democracy to come. And Derrida is advocating that European Union produces a model for that kind of a democracy to come. But he has been talking about European Union early 2000. European Union has undergone many such transformations, much of which are not exactly in line with their framework of human rights. So the framework of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and some such other universal frameworks which are in existence are to be pursued in respective nation states in order to establish a more mature democracy which will fulfill Derrida's vision of democracy to come. And this is how political theory can help a new form of democracy, which Derrida is expecting to be fulfilled by this unconditional acts of giving, which will include a logic of emancipation, a logic of argumentation, without the constraints of the system, moving beyond the supervision, surveillance, and the technical control on the political subjects by the system. And that democracy is yet to emerge, is yet to come, which is like a dream, and which is a democratic dream, and which is a dream of democratic political theory as well. I think with these words, I'll stop here. I would be glad to answer your query, comments, and everything. Hans, Professor Horiharan, and others, I give the floor back to you. Thank you all for listening to me patiently.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your thought-provoking lecture. Now the floor is open for questions. Participants may either use the chat box or can unmute themselves to ask their questions.
Professor Biswas,
Yeah, sure.
I am Hariharan, right? So
Yes.
only one small comment. There is,
Sure.
I don't have any words to say, such an extraordinary, fantastic lecture. And you made me to go back to those days where I was reading Foucault's Clinic.
Yes.
I had a fractured reading. There's not the entire book I read, he was talking about the way in which medicines had made, the medicines and disease had made the power relationship between patient, the medical industry and doctors. And it is a really, really thought-provoking lecture, and especially in political theory, it should definitely open a new insight to all those who really listen to your lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. I humbly accept your compliment. Yeah, let's go to other comments. Hans and others, please. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, yes, sir. So while you were talking about the biopower, sir,
Right.
like Boss had said, he thinks that it should be separate from the disciplinary power, and later on he changes it again.
Yes.
Changes his module. So what are your thoughts on that? What were your thoughts on his process that time?
Yeah, the process of biopower is generally a process of production of a subject who is stuck between the alternative possibilities of life and death. And any of the possibility will become important depending on how the state or the power manifests itself. So therefore, both the possibilities remain open in biopower. And one has to move out of this tangle of biopower, because biopower entangles people with the fear of death. It entangles people with the fear of life, a life without any meaning. So therefore, one has to move out of these double bind of biopower, and one has to go towards an alternative possibility of biopower, which will be a power, an aesthetic kind of power, which one is exercising on oneself in order to speak the truth, in order to build up a better argument, in order to pursue justice, and change the institutional framework to move beyond that kind of biopower. So the process of biopower is just for understanding what this biopower is and what kind of bounds and closures it creates in human subjectivity, and then to move beyond this. Okay, so this is how you can think about it.
So there are a couple of questions in the
Yeah.
comment
Yes.
chat box.
Yes.
So Pavishya is asking, sir, how do you contrast between the model of power as conceived by Foucault and Agamben?
Right. There's a contrast in the sense that Agamben is talking about the power structure in the Third Reich of Hitler, where incarceration, maiming, controlling in racial terms, and also stigmatization become the instrument of exercise of power relations. And laws are twisted to exclude Jews, twisted to exclude certain ethnic minorities. And the moment they are excluded, they are stripped of their rights. So Agamben's concern about biopower and biopolitics leads to that kind of a state of exception where rights are stripped off. Foucault is not so much bothered about rights being stripped off, but he's bothered about a kind of a politics of death. Certain kinds of death is disqualified, or the very idea of dying a dignified death. Gandhi used to call it a spotless death. Foucault's concern is that biopower does not allow a spotless death. Anyone who dies with a trail of corruption, trail of bad name, foul things. So therefore, biopower is to subject people in their death with all kinds of vile attributions, which will directly go against a vision of positive life. Foucault is more concerned about that kind of a micro-level operation of biopower, while Agamben is concerned about macro-level operation of biopower. That will be the kind of distinction, macro and micro distinction here. Okay. Now, the other question, yeah, please.
Yeah, the other question is from Porkudi. She's asking, is it possible to establish a democracy as per Derrida's envisionment, given the realist view of the human nature, which is innately selfish, evil, and greedy?
Right, right. The point here is that there is nothing like innate human nature. The human nature has to evolve. Human nature, which was there in 16th century, is not the same in 20th century. Human nature can also see certain liberatory potentiality. Now, much of the human nature is stuck between potentiality and what he calls impotentiality, that is potentiality not to. So there is this duality between potentiality and potentiality not to. Now, if we take one side of the potentiality, which is potentiality in terms of an innate version of human nature, in terms of selfishness, which is an idea of self-preservation, an idea of greed, an idea of accumulation, can also be contrasted with the idea of moving beyond greed to altruism, to talk about a larger common welfare, which ensures one's own individual well-being, which is operative at a larger institutional level, in which selfishness will not have much of a place. So within democratic political theory, the question of human nature is addressed in institutional terms, in terms of a common public good, projecting which one can move out of what is looked as innate, or what is just the potentiality. One has to move towards potentiality not to be greedy, not to be selfish, as Agamben would say. So there's a way of ethical transition or a political transition from what is looked as innate to what is not so innate, what is exterior, which is driven by something that is externally more provocative. Okay? But something that is externally more provocative doesn't necessarily always liberate one, but at least it allows a certain exit from the narrow shells in which an individual is living. But one has to find correct ethical ways of reshaping and re-articulating one's behavior by moving into a larger domain, as it is. Yeah. Then there is this question: truth effect, subject effect, and system of governance, and democracy as an illusion, etc., etc. Now, point here is that we have to reflect on what the ideas that we are mooting. If we are mooting the idea of a truth, which is in line with the official truth, and which does not serve the purpose of a large number of populace, in fact, excludes the larger good of the larger section of the people. So that kind of truth effect, has to be overcome by a larger will to truth, as Nietzsche would talk about. So it's not merely the case that we bear with the effect, but we also get out of the effect. We have to have a redeeming feature, a kind of a redemption, a kind of a move beyond, which is part of our rational capability, which has to be exercised. And one cannot dismiss it to be a delusion. But this possibility awaits, as a future at the end of the road, and one has to explore those possibilities. And that is how one can move out of the domain of effect and can move towards something that is more liberatory or emancipatory. Okay, so we can go to the next question, right?
Okay, thank you, sir. If there are any other questions, the participants can comment in the chat box or can unmute themselves.
So,
We may take a few.
Yes.
Hello? Yeah,
Yes,
please.
yes.
so thank you for the lecture. So I just had a question. So when Derrida talks about the fatal issue of autoimmunity in a democracy, and later he also goes on to talk, like you said, about unreserved hospitality. So can unreserved hospitality then be considered or looked at as a solution to this fatal issue of autoimmunity? Because even in a democracy is characterized by unreserved hospitality, there will still be this issue of freedom versus equality. So how would you put that? So how would you look at that?
Yes, so freedom versus equality needs to be resolved. Autoimmunity creates a certain kind of a blockage or closure. It closes one to a set of principles, let's say, a set of working conditions. So autoimmunity actually reduces the immunity. It doesn't produce the immunity. So one has to move beyond autoimmunity, and one has to ensure that an autoimmunized society is rather, sparked off, is rather twisted to accept a set of fresh ideas. And autoimmunity cannot completely block the possibility of having new window of ideas, Derrida would say. So therefore, autoimmunity is not the ultimate condition of democracy. It's just a transitory phase of democracy. One can move out of autoimmunity. First of all, that's very, very important. An unreserved hospitality to the radically other, another which is not known to me, but another who comes from a very different shore, another with whom I enjoy the ethical possibility of a friendship, has to be explored. That we have to move from the domain of the actual to the domain of the possible. And how we do it? The act of theorization and creation of new praxis of friendship will enable us to move from the domain of the actual to the domain of the possible. And that's how human desire or the economy of desire works for Derrida. And this will bring in new set of institutions, and it's real. It's not something that is unreal. Yeah. Right? So this is how we can look at it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Now, as we are nearing the end of the special lecture, I would like to call upon Shruti from 2nd BA to render the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon to all of you. First and foremost, I thank God Almighty for making today's event a grand success. On behalf of the Department of Political Science, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Prasenjit Biswas, sir, for this incredible lecture on bare life and democracy to come. Thank you, sir. It was a remarkable session. Lastly, I thank the members of the faculty and the students of the Department of Political Science, their participation and cooperation in today's program. Thank you all and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thanks to all. So bye-bye for now. I'll move out.